Hi, everybody. I'm Nate Wiggum. I'm with Ian Capital. We do commercial real estate capital advisory, debt and equity placement across all property types all over the country. And I'm here with Adam Greenfader.
Thanks, Nate. Adam Greenfader here, managing partner of AG&T. We are real estate developers and advisors. We focus on residential and hotel properties in the Caribbean, Latin America, and Puerto Rico.
Today, we're going to talk about Puerto Rico, but specifically in the context of bringing back critical manufacturing to the U.S. and how Puerto Rico traditionally has fit into that equation and what the opportunity around that really is today. I think one thing that's really critical for people to understand in this conversation is not only is there a great opportunity to bring a lot of that industry here, a lot of that industry here already exists. Some of it went away when 936 left, but there still is a tremendously significant presence of these industries that are very active on the island.
Yes, so true. I mean, you and I have been active in trying to promote tourism for Puerto Rico, which is, less than 7% of the GDP. So really, we're trying to sell the concept of tourism, and we discussed the reasons why. Basically, Puerto Rico was the manufacturing hub of the world, so it didn't need tourism. And having said that, in this new COVID-19 reality, critical manufacturing and life science manufacturing, both for the United States and every single other country, is really about reshoring. And I think that the one lesson that the world has seen from this crisis today is that we've got to take care of our countries, and we've got to have our own medicine and our own masks and our own respirators manufactured close by. I mean, we can't have a supply chain that makes us rely on third parties who might have interests different than our own. It's like saying, if you were going to fight a war, would you have your munitions being manufactured in some country that you're fighting? No, of course not. That just makes no sense.
Right.
So Puerto Rico is the big winner, I believe, in this COVID-19 world, the post-COVID-19 world, because it was always a manufacturing hub. Puerto Rico was always the United States' place to go to make, pharmaceutical drugs, for its life sciences, and the economy is still very strong today in manufacturing, so it doesn't have to reinvent itself. It's going to happen naturally. Puerto Rico, while it has lost a lot of its manufacturing, in years past, it still has all the big players on island. All the top manufacturing companies know of Puerto Rico. They know of the quality of the labor. I was actually just speaking to a top German pharmaceutical CEO yesterday, and who had never heard of Puerto Rico, and just as early as 2019 wanted to manufacture some coated pharmaceutical pills. And he was normally doing that work in Mexico, but for some snafu in the supply chain, he was looking for a new location. So he did a trial run in Puerto Rico and was amazed by the quality of the labor. And without even considering the tax incentives or looking at all the other benefits of the island, he made his decision to move his company to Puerto Rico purely on the quality of the labor of Puerto Rico manufacturing. So that speaks to, the island's skill set. 49 FDA-approved manufacturing centers. 12 of the top 20 pharma companies of the world are in Puerto Rico. So, this COVID-19 environment is really bringing the attention back. To bringing critical manufacturing back to the United States. And I think Puerto Rico should play a very strong role in that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, just again, putting things in perspective, Puerto Rico has twice the amount of pharmaceutical manufacturing here as the next state that's active in the space, which is Indiana.
Yeah, that's just so hard to believe, right? I mean, you think about it, you say, how can Puerto Rico manufacture more than Indiana? And it's been doing it for 50 years.
Like we talked about common misconceptions around Puerto Rico. I mean, people, you mentioned earlier, 40% of Americans before Maria didn't even know that Puerto Rico was a U.S. territory. Absolutely, virtually nobody probably knew that Puerto Rico was the United States medicine cabinet for a very long time, and absolutely continues to be so.
Yeah, I mean, when you see your Tylenol bottle, it says made in the United States, but Puerto Rico is part of the U.S., so Puerto Rico was never getting that marketing.
Right. So I know we're kind of really driving this point home, but if we think about Puerto Rico's positioning relative to post-COVID, because tourism is such a small part of its economy, and like you mentioned earlier, you and I have been working together for a while to promote tourism development, which I still think is probably a good opportunity on a long-term basis. But Puerto Rico is really uniquely well positioned to weather this because half of its economy today essentially is manufacturing. Half of that is the pharmaceutical and medical manufacturing. And there's so much infrastructure that still exists on the island for those industries that is being underutilized that you can reactivate very, very quickly.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, while roads, internet, airports, ports are critically important, Puerto Rico also has a fresh supply of water. Very, very uncommon for most places of the world. I mean, Puerto Rico in the 1900s generated all of its electricity from a few dams on the island. So Puerto Rico has fresh water, which is obviously very important for manufacturing. And as we talked about, we are all hopeful that a lot of these plants in the future will be able to generate their microgrids, be able to use some of the community development block grant funding to do so. And we're hopeful that this is going to create manufacturing 2.0 for Puerto Rico and take it to new levels that it hasn't seen before.
Right. So we talked a little about the Puerto Rican labor force, but in continuing this conversation, even today, there's over 90,000 existing manufacturing workers here on the island, and tens of thousands of them specialize specifically in pharma and bio.
Yeah, I mean, the picture here is of the University of Puerto Rico, Rio Piedras. The University of Mayagüez, the RUM, is the top engineering university in the United States, one of the top. It graduates hundreds of engineers every year. The majority of them leave Puerto Rico and go to the United States to work in pharmaceutical manufacturing companies and other such engineering companies. But the Puerto Rico, because it's been around for 50 years as a manufacturing hub, it's developed this educational system to produce engineers. So you've got this just great STEM program. The number that I heard recently was 26,000 STEM graduates every year from Puerto Rico. So obviously, if you're a manufacturing company and you're looking for good workers, having this educational system in place is really important. But I think something that a lot of people forget is Puerto Rico, because it's an island, has very little amount of transitory lifestyles, right? People come to Puerto Rico, they end up living on the island, and many of them end up working in the same company for years, if not decades. So unlike the United States that has workers that can go from state to state, and every couple of years they may move, your workers in Puerto Rico tend to stay for a long time, with a company. That's been our experience. I would like to say that our average employee in Puerto Rico has been with us for over 30 years. Now that's incredible. We've got people, who are in their 60s and 70s still working in our company, and they were, they came on in the 60s and 70s, 1960s and 70s. So, long story short, Puerto Rico has a great manufacturing labor force, well educated, and it's got this university system. So you add that on top of this kind of low cost of living compared to the U.S., and it makes it a really attractive place for manufacturing companies. The most and perhaps best benefit of Puerto Rico labor force is that it's less expensive than in the United States. So from a pure dollar perspective, 20 to 25% less expensive. So if you're looking at Indiana or New York or Florida to set up a manufacturing plant, your costs are going to be less in Puerto Rico. So that's a huge win for industry, and it's a huge win for the workers of Puerto Rico.
So if I'm a pharma company and I come to Puerto Rico, I get really high quality labor with engineers or highly skilled labor. It's a lower cost than what I would pay probably in maybe every other state, and I have higher employee retention.
Yeah, I think that's pretty much a win-win. We actually conducted a study in graduate school comparing a Hewlett-Packard plant in Texas and a Hewlett-Packard plant in Aguadilla, Puerto Rico. It was an efficiency study. It was the same plant making the same product, same exact configurations. And interestingly, when the two plants were compared side by side on efficiency, the Puerto Rico plant came heads and shoulders in terms of efficiency above the Texas plant, namely because it had, even though everything was the same, the infrastructure was the same, the product was the same, the site area was the same, it had a homogeneous workforce. meaning that, everyone from top management, middle management to workers in Puerto Rico were all speaking the same language, knowing the same culture, many of them living in the same towns, whereas the workers in the United States really were a confluence of many different ethnicities and groups and lived in different areas. So, having the same workforce, having that homogeneity in Puerto Rico really adds to the quality of the workforce.
Right. So here's a graphic just showing some of the existing bio and pharma companies that are here active on the island. You can see that really it's all over the island. These industries are such a ubiquitous presence here and have been so for so long. They kind of cover the map.
I mean, just look at the names: Pfizer, Eli Lilly, Boston Scientific, Teva, Bristol Myers, AbbVie Pharmaceuticals, Johnson & Johnson. The list goes on and on and on and on. And we're seeing a lot of European companies now, Sartorius. It's really incredible to see the depth and the quality of the manufacturing in Puerto Rico.
So just more statistics again about the productive power of Puerto Rico relative to the space. You can see that last year the U.S. exported almost $67 billion of these types of products. And again, look at the comparison, right? You got 16.4 coming out of Puerto Rico, and you've got less than half that coming out of Indiana and less than half that coming out of California. It really, really puts things in perspective. So let's talk a little about the 2017 Tax Act. We talked about opportunity zones and how that's a benefit to the island, but there was some things that were a part of that act that may not be so beneficial for the island.
Well, 217, besides hurricanes and fiscal board and all the other problems that happened in Puerto Rico, the 217 U.S. Tax Act really kind of put the nail on the coffin for the island from a tax perspective. And without getting into too much detail, the overview on this was Puerto Rico has always, it's part of the United States, but it's always been treated as a foreign tax jurisdiction. And that's kind of been that loophole which has allowed companies to work in Puerto Rico and have a special tax incentive. In 217, the Tax Act attempted to try to bring U.S. companies back home to the mainland. And while we all think that's really important, especially today post-COVID, for Puerto Rico, it created a situation. In particular, there's two provisions: the GILTI provision, GILTI, which is the Global Intangible Low Taxed Income, and the BEAT provision, which is the Base Erosion and Anti-Abuse Tax. It created two provisions which, for all intents and purposes, took away Puerto Rico's competitive advantage. So Puerto Rico today is taxed just like if you were working in China or Ireland or Mexico, and has lost a lot, if not most, of its favored tax positioning. And this, if it is not rectified, will only continue to really drain a lot of the pharmaceutical and life science companies that haven't already left Puerto Rico. And in particular, it really diminishes some of the tax incentives on copyrights and other type of really special licensing for drugs that's critical to pharmaceutical companies. So, we are hopeful that post-COVID, while the new tax code is being rewritten, Puerto Rico is able to regain its status, its unique tax status, and allow pharmaceutical companies to have incentives to move on the island. There's two different House resolutions right now that are being proposed. One is HR 6443 and the other is 6448. 6443 is sponsored by Jennifer Gonzalez, who's the Congresswoman of Puerto Rico. And essentially, the title of it is Securing the National Supply Chain Act of 2020. HR 6443 attempts to make some changes to these GILTI and BEAT provisions. And it's a very small act. And hopefully with those efforts, we can kind of go back to how Puerto Rico was treated before. It's not necessarily a 936 tax incentive, but it would definitely provide incentives. The HR 6448, which is sponsored by Stacey Plaskett, which is Congressman, U.S. Virgin Islands, is this Territory Economic Recovery Act, which in a similar vein tries to create areas throughout the United States and the territories where manufacturing can be incentivized, especially critical manufacturing. So I guess the message here is that we're all looking to bring critical manufacturing back to the United States and hopefully back part of that back to Puerto Rico. But we really do need Congress to step up and make this possible so that the manufacturing companies will be incentivized to do so.
Right. So wrapping all this up, really what we're trying to communicate here is that Puerto Rico really is the natural location for U.S. critical supply chains. It's already here. It's been here for a long time. There's a lot of existing infrastructure that's here on the island that, again, can be very easily and quickly reactivated. There's some tremendous tax advantages with regards to not being a state and not having federal representation. But positive benefit of that is that you don't pay any federal taxes. And then you have a lot of local tax incentives with regards to various tax credit programs and things of that nature for a variety of industries that you can stack all these together. And then on top of that, something like 97 or 98% of the island is an opportunity zone. So basically anything you're going to do here, you're almost certainly fall into that status. So you can combine all these incentives, create some tremendous economic opportunity. And then as we talked about earlier, when people think about Puerto Rico and some of the economic history, one of the most important things for potential investors to understand really is the role of the Fiscal Oversight Board, the direct role that it plays with regards to controlling Puerto Rico's spending and borrowing to not only make sure that it's coming out of the economic crisis, which it has been. I think they've been doing some good a good job in that respect, but also making sure that nothing like that can happen again, really being a backstop for the Puerto Rican economy.
Yeah, I mean, this is a great slide, Nate, and I think that you summarized it really well. The only thing that I can add is that this COVID crisis has really taught us a lot of lessons, but I think the most important one is that we just can't let this happen again. We were all, as a world, we were all caught unprepared. We did not have the right medical systems in place, testing systems in place, supply chains in place to combat a crisis like this. This won't happen again. We will be prepared. We will take the necessary actions, and Puerto Rico is ready to step up and help make America a better place, a safer place, and make all of us have more control of our health.
We appreciate you taking the time to watch this presentation. Hope it was informative. If you're interested in learning more about the opportunities in Puerto Rico, of which there are many, feel free to reach out to either one of us. There's a link below to go to our website to download a copy of the presentation as well.